Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second webinar focused on trace tools for detecting illicit money flows. I just want to share the screen that our today's webinar topic is trace tools in practice. Before we proceed, I'd like to inform you that we are recording this session. The session will be available as part of the trace training resources online for those who wish to revisit this webinar or for the benefit of those who couldn't join us today. My name is Bogdan Adamek. I'm from Aston University, United Kingdom. During the webinar, participants can ask any questions. We have a Q&A session. Please use the chat function to submit your question at any time during the webinar. The aim of today's webinar is to explore the capabilities of trace tools in detecting and understanding illicit money flows. It's a critical issue that affects global security and governments. Here on the slide, you can see a brief agenda of today's webinar. So we are fortunate to have three great presenters. It's Professor Umut Turkson, coordinator of the TRACE project from Coventry University. It's Thomas Havranek, director of SIN Consulting from Austria, and Alison Schultz from
the Tax Justice Network.
Tax Justice Network. And after the presentations, we will have our Q&A sessions. Professor Turkson will discuss the use of electronic evidence in illicit money flows investigations. His insights will provide a foundational understanding of the capabilities of trace tool in forensic investigations. Dear Umut, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bogdan.
Just a moment, I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Okay, since we're looking at trace tools in practice, as you know, all our tools have been developed on the back of rule of law, ethics, human rights, fundamental principles. And what I'm going to present to you is part of that work, particularly our work package 7. So when we set out to achieve these objectives, we had a workflow of different tasks, work packages, and optimization of information sharing practices and also investigations that we've considered under work package 7 has resulted in two separate but interrelated reports. Incidentally, these are public, so for once I'm able to share something that is public rather than confidential as part of our deliverables. So today's presentation I will put forward for you to consider and ask questions about really combines these two elements, electronic evidence and cyber forensics, two topics examined in work package 7. And as I do that, in the end, I will also introduce you to our Trace VI framework, which encompasses various elements that we think should be embedded in any technological tool that employs electronic or digital evidence. So I'll explain these. And why are we talking about electronic evidence? Because various institutions and their reports and having talked to end users and law enforcement agencies, we know that 85% of all crime or criminal investigations involve some form of digital or electronic evidence, and 65% of those investigations, at least in the European Union, involve a request made to service providers based in another country. So a cross-border kind of request for electronic evidence. Subsequently, 55% of total investigations include the request to access trans-border electronic evidence because the crime or the perpetrators may be residing in different jurisdictions. So as a result of this, of course, it becomes quite clear and evident that we need a harmonized legal system as well as tools that would help law enforcement agencies, especially in the context of prevention, detection, investigation, and recovery of illicit money or proceeds of crime. And this goes with, of course, forensic capabilities as well. So while we have various definitions of electronic evidence in different legal instruments, in our work, we've adopted the definition from the Council of Europe, and electronic evidence in terms of its format can be divided into two main categories: content data and non-content data. And non-content data could be traffic data or subscriber data. So once we identified those, we've set out to identify what law governs those different types of data, electronic data in the EU. So what we have is quite relatively recent legal framework composed of two main legal instruments, what we call the EU Evidence Legislative Package. So we have a regulation and a directive. So this informed predominantly our work when we were looking at the standards of how we collect and use and transfer and secure electronic evidence. So despite of this harmonization at EU level, we still have disparities, differences, different approaches when it comes to electronic evidence. And hopefully the more kind of projects or tools that are developed, such as the ones in the TRACE project, are progressing, then we'll have a better standardization in all aspects of electronic evidence. So this is a good kind of contribution through the TRACE project in this regard. So if you go into a little bit more detail about what these two legal instruments do at the EU level, what we call the Evidence Legislative Package. The regulation in particular defined elements of electronic evidence. It talks about or provides the mechanisms for European Production Order, European Preservation Order, and how decentralized IT systems of communication amongst service providers and relevant authorities need to be utilized, and how in doing so fundamental rights and principles ought to be observed, and the legal effects of using electronic documents are also covered by the electronic evidence regulation. The e-evidence directive, on the other hand, it designates the establishment of appointment of legal representatives in the EU, and it also sets out the mandate for central authorities to ensure consistent and proportionate application of the law. So, and in doing so, it provides legal certainty and clarity for service providers. So against this backdrop, what we wanted to do was to look at how each country that we've examined approaches electronic evidence. And in doing so, we compiled information from 15 different EU member states. And when we send our survey or questionnaire, we kind of designed it to cover all these aspects you see on your screen, how each legal system defines electronic evidence, what's the legislation on electronic evidence, if any, what would be the court cases that they could tell us, what are the recent interpretations of the law perhaps on electronic evidence, its use, its admissibility in criminal proceedings, and how law enforcement agencies authenticate electronic evidence, what are the standards, how do the judiciary approach the electronic evidence, as particularly in terms of admissibility of electronic evidence in court proceedings, and what are the best practices on preservation and ensuring the integrity of electronic evidence and its admissibility, and what would be the rules, cross-border transfer of e-evidence, and the impact of international and regional, in this context, European Union, legal instruments relating to cross-border exchange of electronic evidence, and challenges and opportunities that end users face in using electronic evidence. And we also ask what tools, if any, they use in each country that would help them to identify or ensure or analyze electronic data, electronic evidence, particularly from the legal industry. And if they are aware of any emerging technologies or trends that would be shaping the future of electronic evidence in court proceedings, and the implications of electronic evidence for digital forensics and the role of forensic experts in court cases. So our findings and then the subsequent recommendations are informed by responses to these subject areas or to questions related to these subject areas. So in summary, if we were to distill what we found among many things is that as I already said, we have quite a different approach and disparities in technology adaptation across the regions we examined. And some regions don't have automated detection tools, while others face challenges integrating new technologies into their existing systems. And there are also procedural differences, different standards of data protection, and insufficient level of cooperation between jurisdictions. So these kind of combined together can complicate and does complicate the landscape for effective law enforcement and investigation of illicit money flows. If you look at the other work conducted by our colleagues at Aston University in our deliverable 7.4, they identified through their survey that these 4 are the most pressing crimes requiring cyber forensics, and some of which, of course, are quite closely related to our use cases in Trace. So the first one was financial fraud and identity theft, ransomware attacks, one of our use cases in Trace project, cyber espionage, and attacks on critical infrastructure. All happening on the cyberspace, therefore requiring an element of forensics and electronic evidence gathering and preservation. And other findings, again, from our colleagues at Aston University, if we were to kind of summarize them into 3 things, one is the technological gaps, which is actually reinforcing what we found in our work to do with electronic evidence. There is critical need for advanced analytical tools because of the volume and complexity of data that is coming in front of law enforcement agencies. Procedural inconsistencies, again, this coincides and confirms our findings in electronic evidence deliverable about procedural standards across jurisdictions, and training and skills development has been identified as another area that we need to address. Key findings from the Aston University work on cyber forensics can be, in terms of the policy implications, can be summarized in 5 topics. Again, going in parallel to our findings, fragmented legal systems, resource constraints, rapid technological change, encryption and anonymity, making it difficult for law enforcement agencies to identify individuals behind malfeasance activity, and public-private cooperation are some of the key findings they've come up with. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, us at Coventry University have come up with this framework. We call it Trace VI framework, and each letter standing for a different area, and then each area corresponding to a recommendation we made as part of our work. So T for transparency corresponds to our 2 recommendations: ensuring enhanced standardization of electronic evidence processes, whereby all EU member states establish clear details and metrics of electronic evidence collection, production, preservation, admissibility, and reliability standards. This, as I said, was a fragmented area. And the second recommendation is to establish clear EU-wide guidelines for electronic evidence in both civil, administrative, and criminal law. R stands for reliability. This corresponds to our recommendation 3, whereby we recommend that we need to ensure enhanced data protection ethical protocols in the procedural mechanisms to preserve and produce electronic evidence in line with fundamental principles and human rights. A stands for acceptability, corresponding to recommendation 4 and 5, we need to promote stakeholder engagement and collaboration mechanisms on electronic evidence. And equally important is to break language barriers in the adaptation of electronic evidence in cross-border investigations. C4 capability, this corresponds to 3 different recommendations, namely 6, 7, and 8. 6 being to develop robust and harmonized legal framework for collection, processing, preserving, producing, and admissibility of electronic evidence from both traditional computer systems as well as emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, etc. And 7, the 7th recommendation is to upscale the capacity building efforts for relevant authorities. And 8 relates to promotion of the provision of EU level of legal support and electronic evidence. This goes to the heart of the differences and capabilities between, for example, the state authorities and private entities or persons, whereby equality of arms may not be the same to challenge electronic evidence which is produced by the state authorities. Recommendation 9 is to ensure high degree of compatibility of data and information formats and electronic evidence. So there is streamlining in terms of cross-border analysis and sharing of information so that one type of data is not incompatible in another country where the computer system used is different and is not compatible to analyze the data or the electronic evidence sent to them. So I've jumped a bit from capability to efficiency, where I was mentioning the compatibility of data. So E stands for efficiency, and then V stands for validation. That corresponds to recommendation 10. We recommend that we need to conduct advanced research and continue conducting research and develop effectiveness and efficiency of electronic evidence collection, production, analysis, preservation, etc. in criminal proceedings. And I, lastly, stands for innovation, which corresponds to recommendation 11 and 12, whereby we are in the opinion that we need to counter ephemeral contents from social media and related applications, and then keep pace with technological advancements to enhance the evidence collection and use and admissibility in criminal proceedings. So I hope I am not over time. I will stop there and hopefully you will have some questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Umut, for your insightful presentation. As for me, Trace AI framework is exciting, and it can be as a rule of law for European Union because it's very interesting and consists of many really needed things that are needed now. Maybe any questions, or let's move our question section as we schedule to the end of the. Please, if you have any questions, please write in the Q&A section or on the chat, and we will ask, and our presenters will ask them at the end of the seminar. So if you don't mind, now we will delve deeper into how trace tools can be employed. And I would like to invite Mr. Thomas Havranek, Managing Director of Scene Consulting from Vienna, Austria. Thomas will lead an interactive session. The session will be focusing on the use case involving online gambling networks as vehicles for money laundering. I'm sure that the practical demonstration will showcase how trace tools can be employed in real-world scenarios to identify and analyze illicit activities. Please, Thomas, the floor is yours.
I start again because my microphone was silenced.
Yes,
so
please.
Sorry. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Most of you know me, I guess all of you know me. I'm Thomas, and I introduce you again to Trace Tool and its latest developments, and I try to keep it a little bit interactive. I shared already the screen. Does everyone see my screen now, or is it not shared? Okay, thumbs up there. Thank you very much. So in regards to the project, we also, one of our parts was to develop the tool And in doing so, we also try to picture the process. And my first question to the colleagues who are part of law enforcement agencies here is the flowchart we built is based on the feedback we got from the different colleagues. And of course, trace is the part where we talk about storage, preparation, and analysis of data, inclusive presentation. So that's basically the parts where the trace tool as an application comes into the game. Nevertheless, it would be interesting to get some additional feedback from you guys. How do you usually initiate an investigation? So I guess there are different ways. I know some of them, but it would be good for the audience here because there's a lot of people who may not be involved in actual investigations. How is an investigation in illicit money flows or money laundering or respective the crimes committed to initiate money laundering by itself? How is such an investigation initiated? Hello, Peter?
Yes, we investigate tax and customs crimes. So
Okay.
It's easy with customs crimes. When we stopped the car and found full of cigarettes, it's the case. But tax cases, most of the time, there's two main starting points. It's informants, information, very useful. Many times, of course, tax audits, previous criminal investigation. When we collect during the investigation, we collect more information widerly, so we can see that tax crime. So yeah, that's the main scenarios.
Yeah. So yeah, I confirm that. So I don't know if some of or how much of you know, I'm myself a tax lawyer, and I'm a certified court expert witness for tax crimes and for compliance issues. So I'm involved in a lot of investigations. And yeah, true spoken is, so the funny part is with tax crimes, nearly 70% of tax crimes are released to authorities by informants, and about 90% of these informants are former wives or spouses or girlfriends or boyfriends, and they got dropped, and then they become an informant because they are jealous. So be careful who you deal with. That's one important message I can give you. And then in the normal course of crimes investigations, what we see a lot are informations that come through investigative journalists, especially in white-collar criminal cases. I don't know if some of you followed the big case of the Signa Holding, which is an international real estate company that basically went bankrupt with real estate all over the world. And currently there have been big house raids. And what happens in house raids, then of course, a lot of data is collected. So currently yesterday, they collected a box of 75 kilograms of hard copy data and mirrored several server systems. And all this data then is brought back to the authorities. And then within the authorities, someone has to be appointed to store this data, to administrate this data, to, how do you call it, index the data, where does it come from? So you have to build the chain of custody. Again, this is not part of the trace tool, but it's very important to understand that it is not part of the trace tool, because this is all administrative work that has to be done before you actually start to analyze data. So it has to be ensured, especially in regards to the GDPR, especially in regards to ethics, especially in regards to chain of custody and manipulation or possible manipulation, that the data collection and the data processing is done without any problems and can be this path until you investigate this data can be followed sincerely. So when we have done all of these things, these are the parts in here, someone will decide that an investigation has to be started, and this someone is, I don't know, in most countries in Europe, I guess it's a prosecutor who finally decides if an investigation is open or if an investigation is has to be proceeded with. And that's again an interesting question for the colleagues of law enforcement or you, Peter. Is there a way that you decide by yourself how long you run an investigation, or is it solely in the hand of a prosecutor to say you can proceed or you're not allowed to proceed?
When we see the crime, we have to open the criminal case. So, but it's always good to have a talk with the prosecutors.
But at what point? At what point do you have to stop the investigation? Where is your red line that you say I cannot proceed, or who does it decide? Is it you or is it the prosecution who decides to proceed or not?
The leader of the criminal investigation is always prosecutor, of course. But it's most of the time it's our common decision.
Okay. Okay. So what happens then? So when you have this common decision made, and then you have collected the data, you basically can use a tool like Trace. And maybe also interesting because we just finished the reports for some of the deliverables, and one of the deliverables requested to make a market analysis, and we picked out I think the biggest 10 reports about e-discovery and investigation tools. And it's really still the case, and I was astonished that this is the case, that all of the top 15 tools are not from Europe or not from Asia, only from the United States. So it's really important that someone develops a tool like we did and to be used, because it's a very different jurisdiction system here, and the features therefore have to be different. So if we have the documentation and we have all the documents uploaded, we have processed the documents as far as it's necessary, or we have scanned documents, the hard copy documents, what we then find is our library in Trace, where you have these different cases. So in my library, you see different test cases that are used for the development of Trace. And we have also said we look at the casino case. Today I will introduce you to that. So my question to you, colleagues of law enforcement, again, would be, when you have all the data in the storage, when you have all the data available to investigate, where is your starting point of an investigation? So do you start with a person? Do you start with a company? Do you start, or do you have really cases where you have no clue what you start with?
No, that's not possible.
Yeah.
So there must be concrete suspicion that there have to be a crime committed. So there is two ways to start against a physical person or a company.
Okay. So my next question would be to the whole audience, because I think it's interesting to see where we all are, or if we are all on the same page. What is your understanding? And please, there's no wrong answer. What is your understanding? How would you, as an audience, divide data that you have in terms of file types, in terms of being structured? What would you, just your gut feeling, how would you define different types of data for yourself? Any answers are appreciated. Please don't be shy. So that's interesting. It's also an answer, because it's really, we are still at the point where people do not understand how to define data. So what we have to do in investigative analysis, there's two main types of data. there's the unstructured data and the structured data. So who can tell me the difference? What's the unstructured and what's structured data? Make a guess.
Would structured data be something that's taken from like a database and already formatted, and unstructured data be from a pile of documents?
Yeah, exactly. So structured data is basically an Excel sheet that's structured, database that's structured. Emails are a hybrid because they are structured in the terms that you have so-called metadata, which means you know there is a structure in the recipient of the data, there is the sender of the data, there is the date of the email, there's the headline of the email. So it's partly structured, and you can use the structure to build a structured content. Unstructured data is all the data that is in text format. And that's vitally important for trace tools and such, because that's the most difficult to research and it's the most difficult to find your evidence, your e-evidence that you want to produce at the end of the day. So in this library, what we have is only unstructured data. And as Peter already said, what we usually do, we know our suspects. It's not that we usually start a case and say, oh, we found something, but we don't know what we found. So we always have a suspect. We always have a company or a person that is kind of a suspect. So this case, because I play through it all the time, so we have a suspect, and for example, we have different dashboards. That's one of the nice things in Trace. You have the dashboard that extracts you 3 types of entities: people, organizations, and locations. That is pre-built. We have a dashboard that helps you with, that gives you allows you to search data just by names. So for example, here I can start, I can say I look for someone who is called Kalman, and let's see if I find anything. So I find a lot of data where this kind of name appears. Let's see if I find something more defined. So when I put it in here, I see all the data sets that this name appears. So Thomas Daniel Kalman. And so this helps me already because I know my suspect is within the data set. It's still a lot of data. It sounds not so much, 16 documents, but in relation to 82, it's quite a lot. So what I do, I would go back and say, okay, oops. I want to see in my dashboard if I can find this person again. So we have it already up here. And if I go to that, I find only 2 data sets, and now I can work with that, and I go into my documents and see where did I find this data. So I see there's a big report, there's a smaller report, and so I can start to work within all these sets. And what we have built in here is something that's called a knowledge graph. That's quite interesting because what you can do is you can look for a name or an entity. And for example, it shows you where the artificial intelligence knows that something is an entity, like Red Rhino Casinos is highlighted, Vienna is highlighted, CN Consult is not highlighted, but now you say, I want to look at that one, and I know as an investigator, this is really an organization. So I can confirm that, and by doing so, I create this information and change it from information to knowledge, which means that the knowledge graph at the end of the day in my dashboard gives me this little case, and this case tell me that this is an organization that I have found. So with that, I can swipe through data sets very fast, and I can confirm data sets. So we are in this level of trace, we are still a step before so-called large language models, where we have to interact with the artificial intelligence. The important thing is we have to do that as investigators, but because at the end of the day, if we let the AI run everything by itself, we will have to be challenged in court to be able to prove that we confirmed what the AI tells us that is a fact or not a fact. And that's why we built a system like this that the investigator is able to interact with the artificial intelligence. And it's extremely important in terms of ethics and chain of custody that the human intelligence confirms the artificial intelligence and therefore can build a chain of custody that proves what is right and what is wrong, what is a fact or what is only an information. In a different example, what you can do with structured data, for example, we have here contracts. So what we have done, we have uploaded all kind of contracts. And again, in the main sheet, you find normal entity extraction. But to show you also contracts can be kind of structured data, because what happens with standardized papers like lease contracts, leasing, apartment lease contracts, leasing contracts, employment contracts, and so on and so forth, all of them have a pattern. And what Trace can do, it can learn the pattern of a contract, and then you can upload an enormous amount of contracts, and it will always show you the most important entities and structure it by itself. And by structuring it, it also can visualize things like that. Yeah, my internet today is like is all the cameras going. Whatever. I'll show you in another example. But what you can do here now, you can start to search for certain companies. You can start for search. I can start to search for certain leasing objects, and so on and so forth. And again, I can minimize my data set that I have to read very fast. The same you can do with bank transactions or mobile phone numbers, where you see the transactions, where they have gone to, whom they have gone to. And I can, for example, look for someone here. So I find all these transactions that made by our person John Doe in English, in Austrian, in German is Max Mustermann. And you see where these transactions have gone, and then I can hopefully here faster than before visualize the data. That looks much better. Yeah. So, and then for a prosecutor, this is super important because he doesn't have to read hundreds and hundreds of pages, which he would have done before. He can scroll into the system and look for each and every transaction and see exactly where his suspect, Max Mustermann, I can mark him, has transferred or has received money. From which account, from which company, from which person. When I have another suspect, I can connect them and say, look, this is the transactions only between them. So you can work extremely fast to provide evidence to a court. So this is a very short introduction, therefore very short interactive introduction, but I guess you got the main points of the tool. Yeah, so my time is over and I'll give back to Bogdan.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your insightful presentation, and you showed in practice how tools work, and it's amazing. It can connect too many dots and can really help LIAS. Now, maybe any questions to Thomas from our LIAS partners? If not, all questions after all presentations. So I would like to give the floor to Dr. Alison Schultz from Tax Justice Network. She will guide us through assessing geographic risk with the Trace tool. This presentation will highlight how geographic risk data can be integrated into risk assessment, providing crucial insights for policymakers and regulators. Dear Alison, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bogdan. I will also share my screen. So you should be able to see my presentation now, probably. Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Thomas, for introducing in the tool. So I think that's a good basis for what I will be presenting, because I will focus on how the trace tool can be used to assess geographic risk. My name is Alison. I'm from the Tax Justice Network, but as you might figure, much of the integration, of the technical integration, was not done by us from the Tax Justice Network, but it was done by ZIN, where Thomas spoke from, and also by ProFlow. Adrian is also here. So what we provided here is to give the information, to give the risk assessment, which can then be integrated into the tool. Okay, let me start. So as I said, my name is Alison. I'm coming from Rotterdam. I'm based in Rotterdam at the moment, and I'm sharing this picture here from Rotterdam because it fits the case I'm going to present quite well. So you might know that Rotterdam is a super beautiful city, so I hope you know that. You might also know that Rotterdam is well known for the drug trafficking happening here, and that it is one of the biggest entry ports for cocaine for Europe. I think we got superseded by Antwerp last year or the year before, if you look at the seized amount of cocaine. But in general, cocaine trade and in general drug trade, but especially cocaine, is a big problem in the Netherlands and also in Rotterdam. And I guess in this audience, I don't have to mention that is always connected to the problem of illicit financial flows, because those who made their money with cocaine or other drugs need to launder this money somehow. So here, just as one picture, that was, I think, some cocaine they seized last year, if I remember correctly, in Rotterdam, in the Rotterdam port. Okay, and now connected to that, I would like to come back to one of the use cases which we used to have in Trace, which if you followed some of the outputs we had as a total consortium, you might remember this case. If you don't remember, no worries, it's an easy case. So I ask you, remember Charlie? So we had this case of Charlie, and I will, in the following 20-25 minutes, briefly introduce the case of Charlie again, which is a hypothetical case, which might not be super realistic in all parts, but it kind of highlights the different problems which exist when fraudsters use international differences in regulation in order to launder their money. So I will introduce this case of Charlie. I will then give some background on the core idea of the geographic risk assessment, and then show you in the tool how this core idea was implemented and how it could help in this Charlie case, in case we try to find what Charlie has done and try to find out how the exact money was flown by Charlie and his criminal friends. Okay, let me introduce you again to Charlie. Charlie is a medium-sized drug dealer who lives in the Netherlands, and he wishes to launder 200,000 euros from his illegal drug sales to his official bank accounts in the Netherlands. So you can see here that he's really pondering how to do that best. And he has a nice idea for that. So he follows quite a smart strategy. He first opens a bank account in Bermuda, where it's quite probable that no information on him and his bank account will be exchanged with the local financial intelligence. He also opens a gambling account with one of the many casino operators, which is registered in Hong Kong. He verifies his identity there and deposits 5,000 euros from his bank account in the Netherlands to his online gambling account registered in Hong Kong. He then communicates with his customers. So let's assume that Charlie has 20 customers. They are all based in the Netherlands, so 20 Dutch customers. And each of these customers would like to buy drugs from him worth 10,000 euros. So what Charlie asked the customers to do, he asked the first 10 customers, so half of the customers, to open an online gambling account in the very same gambling company in Hong Kong where he is also registered. And these 10 customers use their personal bank account, located in the Netherlands, to transfer 10,000 euros to their online gambling accounts. And they then use the player-to-player transfer possibility to transfer these 10,000 euros to Charlie's gambling account. At the same time, he tries to diversify a little. So he asked the remaining 10 customers to pay him 10,000 euros each via bank transfer, which they do directly from their bank accounts in the Netherlands to his bank account in Bermuda, which he has just opened. And he asked them to split the transfer a little, that each of them doesn't look too big. So each of the drug customers will make 2 transfers of 5,000. Of course, you don't need to remember all of this, but just to get an idea of the intricate structure which is used here. So from his bank account in Bermuda, Charlie then transfers their 100,000, which he got from the second part of the customers, to his online casino account via purchasing 1,000 PaySafe cards at the value of 100 euro each, which you can then bring to the gambling account for gambling. So the gambling account will not, or the gambling operator will not directly allow Charlie to just pay out the money. That would be the easiest for him, of course. But of course, transferring money is also costly for an online gambling operator. So this Hong Kong-based online gambling operator restrict payouts so that the player has to play 5% of his funds in the gambling account. So sorry, I'm missing a verb here. So Charlie needs to gamble a little to just make out for this, or to just overcome this restriction. So Charlie begins to gamble until his funds are not restricted anymore, which then yields the casino profit of 10,000 euros, so also the casino benefits. Then he is allowed to transfer what is remaining in his account, so he wires the remaining 190,000 euros to his bank account in the Netherlands. And as fortunately gambling wins are exempt, for him fortunately, from taxes in the Netherlands, in practice, this allows him to manage his dirty money, the 200,000 euros, for only 10,000 euros. So much to the story. Let's now come to connect it to the trace tool. So now the question is how to find Charlie in the trace interface. And as Thomas has already said, it doesn't mean that the trace interface will be full of stuff and we just try to find it from somewhere without knowing about him. But let's say there's a suspicion, or let's say Charlie had a partner to whom he was very bad, just like Thomas also introduced, then maybe we know something, but we have a lot of data which maybe we got from different sources, maybe different bank transactions that could be connected, lots of different material, which should then help us to establish what really happened. Now I told you what happened, but of course in the usual case, we wouldn't know what happened. So we would have all this data and would like to try to find out what exactly happened and what we can hold Charlie accountable for. Of course, there are a ton of solutions, and I think I'm the less knowledge person in the room to know about all these code solutions. And I'm just trying to present one solution here, which is partly integrated in the trace tools, which is using a risk-based approach to pin down which transactions to prioritize in the investigation, maybe. And here I will focus on geographic risk. I will highlight that again. I'm not saying that this is like the main focus you should always put, or the only one. It's just one which we consider that could be relevant here in the context of using many international transactions to conceal funds. Like I said, I will give some background, but very briefly. I think I have three slides on that. On what is the idea now with geographic risk, both in the context of this case of Charlie, but also in more general. So the question here is, why should geographic risk matter? And this is because of something which is called regulatory arbitrage, which I will explain in a second. So the core idea is super simple, so it actually doesn't need to be explained. So illicit flows are enabled by opportunities for keeping illicit activity hidden. So this also means that money launderers, and this is something which you see in this example of Charlie, money launderers will deliberately structure illicit activity into jurisdictions with a weak regulatory framework, and they might even use the complementaries of different jurisdictions to make this money laundering most useful and most hard to detect. And this is what you call regulatory arbitrage. I've put you some quotes from the academic economic criminology literature here. So what's the core idea here? The core idea is here, if you have financial secrecy in a country, so if a country does not impose too strict transparency laws, then it gets easier to conceal the details of a transaction, which then will lead to a higher probability of concealment. Therefore, we can say that the MLTF, so the money laundering and terrorist finance risk of transaction passing secrecy jurisdiction, is higher as compared to transactions that pass jurisdictions which are very strict in terms of transparency. This does, of course, not imply that all dealings with high secrecy jurisdictions are illicit. Could well be that I have very valid reasons to transact with a bank in Bermuda or with a gambling account in Hong Kong, but it just means that the risk, the probability here is higher. And we actually consider 3 types of geographic risk here. You might have heard that, so I'm doing it very quickly here. And we have established some legal assessment for these different types of risk for the different countries of interest. So the first type of risk is financial secrecy risk, which is just the risk that financial opacity is exploited for financial crime. So this is an assessment of all kinds of laws that allows, or lax laws, lax regulation that allows fraudsters to remain anonymous or to conceal what they are actually doing, for instance, in their bank transactions. Then we have real estate risk. Real estate risks is the risk that real estate is exploited as a vehicle for financial crime, for instance, because you just buy and sell real estate in order to launder money. And finally, we have high value assets risk, which is the risk that high value assets, for instance, art, antique, precious stones, and so on, are exploited for financial crime, something that has, for instance, been seen in sanction evasion a lot with artwork. So now we know that we have these countries where we say they have a specific risk because of the loopholes, and we know that we have the specific cases, and we see some transactions. So how do we bring all this together? And in order to bring all this together, we follow an approach that has been suggested from many sites. So how can we use these risk indicators to assess the risk of a transaction? And actually, one core idea here of how to understand risk and how to understand the risk of money laundering or terrorist financing is something the FATF has summarized in a paper in 2013, but also something you find in all kinds of sources. And the core idea here is that risk is a combination of the likelihood of an adverse event happening, so the likelihood that something bad happens, that this is actually a transfer used for money laundering, and the significance of impact or the damage that we incur if it materializes. For instance, if somebody does a very small thing, like very small money laundering, the damage is not really big. So yes, there is still the likelihood that this might happen, but the risk is considered smaller just because the impact we have or the consequences we have from it are smaller. So we turn this into like a formula which can then be used for the risk assessment. And this is quite general or quite simple. So the idea is that money laundering or terrorist financing risk is a function, which just means it's dependent on the likelihood of a criminal activity and the significance of its impact. This is what the FATF says. So what we do from here is this transaction level analysis that for any transaction which we see, for instance, in our trace tool, the transaction level risk is again a combination of the likelihood of this criminal activity. And if we look at geographic risk factors, we could say this likelihood is higher depending on how the risk scores of the sender and recipients are. You will see the risk scores later, but we have develop these risk scores which go from 0, which means no risk, to 100, which is the most riskiest jurisdiction we could imagine. So this risk score of sender and recipient of a transaction, or we take the average here, is something used to proxy the likelihood of a criminal activity. To proxy the likelihood of the impact, we use the volume of the transaction because, of course, you couldn't just launder way more money if you have a big transaction as compared to a small transaction. We combine them by multiplying the two, and then we take the risk score to the power of 3 and the transaction to the power of 1/3, which just ensures that both part of the information are actually still given in the risk assessment, because if you don't do this weighting, then usually the volume will just determine the transaction level risk. Okay, so much to how this can be combined. And now let's go back to the Charlie example. And as I said, I also would like to give you some ideas of how the Charlie example can be seen in the trace tool. I hope you all see my opened trace tool now. And thanks to Thomas, you already know all the different steps how could you get here. So we have different bank transactions here. They are based on all these different documents here with the information. They are processed in a way that they already are shown as bank transactions. And then what we can do is to visualize those. So let me visualize them just for a second. That's something I've shown you before, like it's basically a big mess. We have so many actors, we have so many different transactions, and it will be super difficult to actually know where to start this investigation with. So we can use different tools now to just make it easier. And as I said, I will focus on the geographic risk tool. So I will first go back to the dashboard, and instead of the single bank transactions, I will let the dashboard show me the same in a better view, where I see the bank transaction view, which always gives me the sender. So from whom is the transaction coming, the recipient, to where is the transaction going, and the two countries, the countries of the sender from country, the country of the recipient to country. Then on the right, we see the amount, which is translated to US dollars here. We see the risk score of the sender and the risk score of the recipient. And then we also see the contribution to overall risk. We can now, again, visualize this in the iris part. Should work now. So now it already looks a little more ordered, but still not really well to oversee. So there are basically two things related to geographic risk we can do now for the entire network. And the first thing is something that we can just show the geographic risk. We have this little icon on the right, which we can tag, and then all the different nodes get a colored circle around them. For instance, we have a node here, which is yellow, which also shows that there's a risk of 65. We have another node, which is green here with a risk of 37. So you already see that the one is based in a more risky jurisdiction than the other. However, still, this doesn't really help us to narrow down where we should maybe start, with which transaction we should start. And this is something we can do on the left here. So we can show the display options. Then we can actually select which different things we want to see and which we don't want to see. And now I have to add something I actually forgot to say before. So in case you would like to try this out later on yourself, you can just drop me an email with the person who would like to access the account, and then Proflow has promised to just give you access to exactly the same data. Much of this data is just the synthetic data which we constructed around these cases. So you can just try around the exact same things which I'm showing you right now. Okay, so continue in the display options. We want to see all companies, all persons, but let's assume we don't want to see the low risk and the medium risk people. Now we already see that the entire graph gets way easier to oversee, and maybe let's check what is happening in this part where it's getting very crowded. And we see two entities which are quite central here. The first is here, and I will scroll in more, I hope you can see it. It's the gambling account in Hong Kong. And we already see that there's also a connection to another very central node, which is the bank in, or which is a bank in Bermuda. So of course we constructed the data as such, but this is how you could now see, by starting with the most risky transactions, to maybe start somewhere where some fishy activity is happening. We will now start with investigating further what is happening in Bermuda here, and the tool now also allows you to get more detailed information on why this bank in Bermuda might be risky and what exactly might be happening here. We already know what is happening, and this is also good because I don't have too much time. So I will just show you how we could now trace back all these Charlie activities to what we see in the tool. So let's start with Bermuda. I click on this one, and this will open a small panel here on the right, showing me the risk score of Bermuda. So the risk score is 70.1 out of 100, which is quite high. Therefore, it's also shown in orange here. We can in case we forgot what the risk score is, or in case we don't really know what this is all about, we can just hover over the little I, which will explain us again what exactly is measured here. So here, for instance, if I go to the I of financial secrecy risk score, it tells me reflects how much a country's laws, regulations, and administrative practices allow for secrecy. Registration of the beneficial owners of legal entities, the obligation to file accounts, and implementation of international standards and cooperation are among the features that reduce the assessed risk of a country. So we already know that Bermuda might not score so well with these features, but why exactly would it make sense for Charlie to register a bank account here? And therefore, we could go into more details of the different features which make up the risk score, and those are listed below. So we have these 4 dimensions: ownership registration, legal entity transparency, integrity of tax and financial regulation, and international standards and cooperation, which are all assessed independently to say why Bermuda or why transactions to Bermuda could be a problem. So here it's about a bank account. So what we're interested in is about the ownership registration. We can also see this again by clicking on the little I, where it says, this dimension assesses a jurisdiction's risk to financial crime, focusing on banking secrecy, asset ownership, and so on. We're interested in banking secrecy. So what I do is I click here, and I get forwarded to the country assessment of Bermuda, and I directly get to this dimension of ownership registration. Now I said I'm interested in banking secrecy because Charlie opened a bank account here. And in particular, I could be interested in this ID, access of administration to banking information. And this ID assesses the following. A question is, does the domestic administration have sufficient powers to obtain and provide banking information on request? And the answer is yes, but there are some problems. And then in the notes, you can read up exactly that the main problem is that for any access the authority wants to have, they need to have a judicial process, and they need to have somebody allowing them to access. And according to the Global Forum, it will be quite difficult to actually ever allow, or not ever allow, but to allow the authorities to get the information on the bank account. So this is why Charlie can sleep very calmly, because most probably his information will never be transmitted to the interested authority. We can then go to the next one. So we also saw that the gambling account has been used. So why is this gambling account based in Hong Kong? So if I click on it again, I see the risk score here. I see the different dimensions here. And before, I already told you that the gambling account is also making quite some money out of this money laundering, because they will force the launderers to also gamble and make some profits out of this. So apparently it's kind of a good economic idea, or a good business idea, to just have a gambling account in Hong Kong. And apparently they are not really traced so often. So maybe it's quite hard to find out who is behind such a casino in Hong Kong. And this is actually something, again, which we can see in these scores. And we see this by the second dimension of legal entity transparency. Again, if we click here, we get all the details for Hong Kong. It will bring us to the, oh, sorry, no, I just scrolled too much. It will bring us to the legal entity transparency. And most interestingly, it will bring us to this secrecy indicator 6, the transparency of company ownership. And here the problem is in the ID 471, which will tell you that the registration of domestic company does not include beneficial owner's identity information. So companies are available without recorded beneficial ownership information. This means while the authorities might know who's the legal owner of this gambling business, they might not know who's the beneficial owner behind it, which means that these businesses can just be opened and closed as they wish, and it's really hard to find out who's the one benefiting from it. Coming to the last example, and I will be soon ready, at least with this example. So in the end, I said that then Charlie transfers the money back to his Dutch account, and that he does not need to pay taxes on the gambling gains. This is also something we can see here. So first, where's Charlie here? We can see that here $399,000 US are paid out. This is transferred to US dollars. So this is exactly the amount which he got in the end to his bank in the Netherlands. And if you now click on the Netherlands, we could now here click on the integrity of tax and financial regulation to find out that actually in the Netherlands, if you have gambling gains from another country, you will not be taxed on them, because the general idea is that the taxes will be paid by the gambling provider, not by the gamblers themselves. So much to how this story could be hidden in the trace tool. Just for illustration, I will briefly also show you how this works for the other indicators. So this was all the financial secrecy indicator. However, we could just do the same for the high value asset risks. I will not go into that amount of detail, but here we have constructed a synthetic data set, which assumes that you got some data from an auction house. This is an Italian auction house. And here again, for this other indicator, here the high value assets would matter because the auction house would usually auction artwork or something similar. So here we could now do exactly the same, but now with an assessment not of financial secrecy per se, but about the availabilities in each country to use these high value assets for money laundering. So again, I could show this geographic risk, or again, I could just filter for it by just showing the high risk transactions. Then I would see very few transactions. Could, for instance, go on this Finnish company here, a bank we invented here. And you see here that now the geographic risk is the high value asset risks. And you could similarly just click on it to see the exact problems of Finland. For instance, Finland promotes free ports for high value asset storage. You can see all the details and the sources here. And actually, they don't provide any transparency about who is owning these assets. Similarly, we could do this for the real estate. And this is actually really now the very last example I give you. So here we just thought about, again, a fake data set where we thought about a LIA that is based in the Czech Republic, which got all kinds of real estate transactions. And here, again, we can now show those where the real estate transactions are probably more riskier in terms of if real estate was used for money laundering. And again, we could just filter for those which, for instance, here are only medium risk. If you now go on, let's take the example for Germany here. So Germany has a risk of 56 out of 100 here, and it's especially bad in registry transparency. So if we click on here, we find out that the problem in Germany here is that there's no central real estate registry, there's no real estate ownership transparency, and then these links, or in general, these pages might also give you some useful links for the investigation. This is what you can see here. For instance, even though there's no central registry, there are pages where you can obtain real estate information from the authorities, and they are linked here. So you could directly go to the place where you can apply for getting some specific information on real estate ownership in one of the German states. Okay, so much to the tool. So, and now I'm just wanted to say thank you very much for listening. And as I said before, and I will just put my email address here again. So if you would like to test the tool, just drop me an email, and then Adrienne and Rudi will allow you access to the tool and to the data. So thanks a lot for listening.
Many thanks, Alison, for your insightful presentation. You really showed how the tool works on a real example, and I guess that our LIAS colleagues would be eager to get to you and Adrian, Rudolf, and Proflor. And now we can move to our question and answer session. So I encourage all participants to ask questions, or you can submit your questions in our Q&A or chat sessions. Please, any questions of our audience to our great presenters. Please feel free to ask any questions.
Can I also just speak for the question, or should I put it in the chat?
No, anyone can ask a question. You just can ask questions.
Okay, thanks. So I think I have a question to you, Thomas. So in general, I always imagine that like uploading all these different documents and then transferring all of this, and so it takes a lot of storage space, I guess. So what are the requirements which you usually would suggest for using the entire trace capabilities?
Thomas, you are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a question of storage space, but layers, the law enforcement agencies have plenty of experience. So this is not a topic we really looked into, because even today, when they go out and mirror server systems, they have to have the storage space already available to store the data. So again, Trace is just a platform to analyze the data, but the storage space should not be an issue.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Any questions, please?
Yeah, I have a question for Ellison. I'm projecting to future, Ellison, and with the transparency kind of index, will you be looking at things that make things even less transparent, such as, non-fungible tokens and, cryptocurrencies and how they are regulated, if they are regulated, and who's responsible for not? Would this be a feature in the upcoming kind of index that TGN produces?
Thanks for this question. Yeah, that's very important, and it's discussed a lot with us. I have to admit that I'm not personally involved in the index creation. So those are usually people who are lawyers, and I'm an economist, so I think other people can do this in a better way. But I know that there will be a new version of our index launched within the next month, and for sure there will be integrated some parts of these new features, like you said, non-fungible tokens, crypto, and things which were not part of the index before. So it will be implemented, and I think it will be communicated clearly what are the new developments and how they will kind of influence these scores which we provide, and the different details, of course. And maybe related to this question, it's also important to say that we provide these scores, and we kind of course, make many decisions on how to weigh different things. Use all these different IDs, use all the indicators, and of course, this means that we kind of decide this is the relevant item here, this is the relevant ID here. This is always a very difficult decision where we discuss a lot. But I think what is the nice thing about tools like Trace is that you wouldn't need to rely on that decision. You could just take all the different IDs which we analyze and compose whatever indicator you want by yourself. So you could just say, okay, for us, the most relevant part is if a country has this and this in place and we don't care about all the rest, then you could just use that for the risk assessment rather than using all the things which might not even be relevant in your case.
And of course, the application or use of such insight is not just for investigations, but one could use it in the private sector for due diligence and advanced due diligence and whatever. I think the transparency tool, let's call it, can help in many other aspects as well. Also policy making at international level, what needs to be done, can be informed by the index as well.
Yeah, that's also something we see actually. We have some private actors who are buying our data. So the data is for free for nonprofits, but we have some few big financial actors who just buy all the insights to integrate it into their risk analysis. And we also see that the scores are discussed in the national risk assessments, which are done in the different countries, but also by the IMF, or also yeah, exactly, and the different fora where these where these and other risk assessments are relevant.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that. And just if I may quickly mention, well, I've got actually two people I need to say this. Adriana and Alison, when we present the work in Brussels in September, perhaps it would be good to combine this element that has been implemented into the tool in our presentation for Work Package 5, I would imagine.
Yes, sure. I think
Thank
I'd like to. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Sure, it should be still up and running.
Thank you, Umut. Thank you, Alison and Adrian. Any questions, please? We can see the tool is great. The trace tool really works and really help investigators to connect the dots between many different cases and using different kind of data, huge amount of data. Maybe if no questions, so I guess that we approach to the end of our webinar. I would like to extend my gratitude to our brilliant presenters for the enlightening contributions and to our audience. Many thanks again for joining us today, especially many thanks to our LIAS partners. I guess that trace tool is very important for them, and they can easily connect Alison, Adrian, Thomas, Umut, and all of us for any additional questions. Thank you very much again. Maybe any questions or comments at the end of the webinar? Thank you.
I can confirm that I showed this trace tool to my investigators. We tested together. So yeah, our investigators, they were sure that it would be useful tool and will help speed up the investigation. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that positive feedback. Thanks, Bogdan, for organizing this webinar, and thank you all the contributors. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.